In this lecture, we're going to create a UI for the dialogue of our game. It's not going to be anything fancy. A traditional box at the bottom of the screen will display the dialogue spoken by the NPC. In the corner of the box, there will be a button to move on to the line of the story. Overall, it's going to be a simple interface. Let's get started. The UI will be added to the main menu template. Open this file with the UI Builder. Similar to other containers, this element will be hidden from the document. We'll toggle the element's appearance whenever the player talks with the NPC. First, let's add the container. From the library, drag the visual element into the root of the hierarchy. Next, let's set the name of the container to the following: Dialog Container. As mentioned before, the dialog UI should appear at the bottom of the screen. Some games will position the dialog box at the top. It depends on the game you're developing. From our game, we're going to position it at the bottom. In the styles, let's update the position style to absolute. Next, set the left and bottom fields to 0 pixels. The box should be positioned at the bottom. After moving its position, we should update the width. The dialog will take up 100% of the width. In the size section, set the width field to 100%. As for the height, it'll be left as auto. It'll automatically scale with the size of the content. We're almost finished configuring the styles. The dialog UI shouldn't sit near the edges of the game. There should be breathing room. Let's add padding. I'm going to set padding on all sides to 60 pixels. So far, so good. Let's work on the container for the dialogue. This process will be simple because we've outsourced the styles into a class. Drag a visual element onto the dialog container element. Next, under the Style Sheets section, add a class called Primary Container. In the previous section, we created this class to add a background and border to an element. If we look at the preview, the class added our container. It's positioned in the center of the parent container, which is what we want. This is the advantage of using classes. We can reuse styles on multiple elements from a single source. The last step is to add the buttons and text. Let's start with the text. From the library, drag and drop the label element into the inner visual element. Same as the container, we have a class to help us set the initial styles of the element. Under the Style Sheets section for this element, add a class called Base Text. There are a few adjustments I'd like to make. I don't think the current styles match the dialog UI. Scroll to the text section. First, we're going to turn italics mode off. Next, set the font size to 32 pixels. For the color, let's use the following hex code: 763E3E. Lastly, let's remove the outline by setting the width to 0. The text is ready. Before moving on to the buttons, we should add a name to the text. In a future lecture, we're going to dynamically update this text with the text from the story. In order to do so, we must be able to select the element. It'll be easier to select the element with a name. Let's set the name to Dialog Text. Great, time for the buttons. The button will inform the player that they can move on to the next line of dialogue. Alternatively, if the story has choices, we should display a button for each choice. Let's drag a button element into the visual element. This element should have a name. We're going to toggle its appearance based on the current dialogue. Therefore, it should have a name. Set the name to Dialog Next Button. For the inner text, write the following: Next. Lastly, let's update the appearance. Luckily, we've outsourced the design of our buttons to a class. Under the Style Sheet section, add a class called Menu Button. I don't like the position of the button. Let's move it to the bottom right corner with absolute positioning. Under the Position section, let's set the Position field to absolute. Next, set the right field to 50 pixels. The bottom field will be set to -40 pixels. Great, the button looks great. The last thing we'll do is set the display style to none. Initially, the button should be hidden. We don't know if the player can move on to the next dialog line or have to make a choice. Toggling the appearance of the button will be based on where the player is in the story. Let's work on the final set of buttons for selecting a choice. Unlike the next button, choices will be displayed with multiple buttons. We should wrap the buttons in a group. Similar to the next button, the buttons for displaying the choices will have their visibility toggled. Rather than toggling individual buttons, we can toggle the group. It'll be faster and simple. From the library, drag a visual element into the visual element in the hierarchy. Set the name of this element to Choices Group. Next, let's drag 2 buttons into this group. In our story, we had 2 choices, yes and no. So, we'll add buttons for each choice. Let's assign names to each button. For the first button, set the name to No Button. In the text field, add the word No. For the second button, set the name to Yes Button. In the text field, add the word Yes. The last steps are to update the styles of these buttons. I'm going to add the Menu Button class to both buttons. That should get them to the desired appearance. The buttons look great. The only problem is their position. They should sit at the bottom right corner like the other button. I'm sure you can figure this out yourself. Try moving them to the correct location. Bonus points if you can get the buttons to sit side by side. Pause the video and give this a try. Good luck! Let's walk through the solution together. Select the Choices Group element from the hierarchy. If we move the parent element, the buttons should move with the parent. Under the Position section, set the Position style to absolute. Next, set the right style to 50 pixels and the bottom style to -40 pixels. Lastly, let's update the direction of the elements. Currently, they're stacked on top of one another. We can change the direction by updating the flex settings. Set the direction style to row. Your button should look similar to mine. After making those changes, we can hide the buttons by setting the display style to none. Similar to the next button, we don't know if the story wants to display a set of choices. We should manually toggle the appearance of these buttons based on the current state of the story. The UI is complete. There's one last thing to do. Select the dialog container. We're going to set the display style to none. By default, the dialog container shouldn't appear. It should only appear when the player is talking with an NPC. In the next lecture, we're going to create a new state for handling the behavior of the dialog container.